No country can boast to be free unless its women are free. That was the message by the South African delegation at the 1995 Beijing conference on women, wherein they pledged to ratify and ratify the Convention for the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. And that's what we're talking about this evening. Good evening. My name is Oliver Dixon and welcome to another installment of Democracy 30. As we kickstart our Women's Focus this month, the struggle to create a non-sexist democratic South Africa has found expression at the CODESA negotiations, resulting in the constitutional recognition of women's rights and later the creation of the national gender machinery to ensure gender mainstreaming across all areas of society. But 30 years on, is South Africa's national gender machinery still effective? Joining us to unpack it this evening, our guest all joining us on Zoom is Lindiwe Zulu, ANC National Executive Member, but also one of the founders of the National Gender Machinery. We're also joined by Colette Litwajane, who is the Executive Director of the Human Rights Institute, who also contributes to, among other things, reviews on the regional protocols such as the CEDAWA and the protocols on women's rights in Africa. And we'll be joined by Professor Amanda Gous, a political scientist from Stellenbosch University, who has also written extensively about the national gender machinery. But first, let's hear from you about your views around the status of women in society today.
Women are still not treated the same 30 years after democracy because there are still GBV cases out here roaming around that are not even being attended by the government.
So far until now, I feel like we are a bit given like a bit of opportunities, as much as we might feel like they're not like a lot and they're not enough like men do have, but like I feel like we have been given an opportunity.
It depends on the area where they're working or where they are, but in most places in South Africa, women have been given an opportunity.
Like for example in high schools, principals now, most of them it's women now. Yabo, izinto ziyashintsha kancane kancane.
Abantu besifazane abahlala emakhaya endaweni esemakhaya kuma villages abatreatwa like abantu besifazane abahlala la endaweni esemadolobheni.
I do believe that women make on average more than men in certain careers. You know, the whole thing about gender equality is, you know, men and women are intrinsically different.
Not necessarily, you know. In SA, there's still these power dynamics where we expect a man to be in higher positions in terms of leadership, in terms of business, in terms of all these sectors. So women in South Africa are still not treated equally.
Like corporation, government 50-50.
We as women get the same opportunities as men. And like there are women who drive buses, men also drive buses. I think it's fair.
I don't believe in that. They are not. We are not treated equally. Not at all.
And of course, we asked the question, in the 30 years of our democracy, have we done enough for the inclusion, substantive inclusion of women into all spheres of society, particularly leadership spheres where great influence is being exercised? But of course, I want to start the conversation with you. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, one can't argue that South Africa hasn't made great progress in the last 30 years to the inclusion of women in politics and business and in other sectors of society, such as civil society and influential spaces, right? But one can still ask, where are the female CEOs when you look at the JSE listed companies on the JSE and look at who the CEOs are? One has to ask, in politics, have we had true representation, substantive representation, more than just cosmetic representation of women? How would you say we've fared over the last 30 years? Prof. Gous, can I just ask that you unmute yourself? It seems that you have muted yourself, and then just start there again for us. There we go. You're loud and clear.
Okay. Let me say we have to make a distinction between descriptive representation, which is about numbers, and substantive representation, which is about representing women's interest and having a policy influence. So in the past 30 years, the only party that has a quota for women is the ANC. It started with 30% quota, and it was increased in 2007 to a 50% quota. Now, the important thing is that we cannot only look at the numbers. I mean, South Africa had 45% women in parliament, one of the highest in the world before the 2024 election. It's come down to 35% now. because the ANC lost seats, and many of those seats belong to women. But substantive representation is what we actually need to look at. And that's how women who are elected to parliament, and let me say it shouldn't only be women, it should be men as well, but let's focus on the women, should actually represent women's interests and also have an impact on policy. And in the last two parliaments, that wasn't really the case. A lot of what's happened was the shift in the national gender machinery, which are the structures in the state that are supposed to promote gender equality. And let me say, my book came out in 2022. It's titled Feminist Institutionalism in South Africa, Designing for Gender Equality, which actually tracks the history of the national gender machinery over a 30-year period. And what we see is that substantive representation is lacking. So that's the situation in government. And I mean, we have replaced basically the national gender machinery with a women's ministry for women, youth, and people with disabilities, who now has to actually treat 3 mandates and not only women.
Yeah. Linda, I want to perhaps come to you. The last time I had seen you, and I want to take you back there because the imagery actually matters quite a lot. I was sitting opposite you at the Market Theatre, and we were both watching a play, Cry for Winnie Mandela. The play chronicled the sacrifices women had to make for the freedom of South Africa. And at various moments, I saw your facial expression, painfully recalling certain moments, I guess, in lives of colleagues, lives of comrades, or perhaps even your own life. Given the sacrifice women had made for the freedom of our country today where we are, do you think women have been given their dues in our democratic institutions? Please unmute yourself as well. I think you've just muted yourself there as well. Yeah, and then just start again.
Yes.
Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank you for even bringing this program up front for us. And I'm hoping that you will not only be having this program because we are celebrating the August month for women, but you'll also pick up on the work that, for instance, Amanda was speaking to, the book that she says she's written. I am thanking you because it is important for us to recognize the fact that communication, in as far as the work that has been done in the 30 years, is very critical, number one. Evaluating what we have been able to do in the 30 years is very important. And I want to take you back to what you said earlier on about Beijing platform. And I want to say I was one of those women, never mind that I didn't go to Beijing, but I was one of those women that prepared for the platform, for the conference itself. And we prepared it not only from a South African perspective, but we prepared for it from a continental perspective of the African continent. So when you refer to the play that you are referring to and my emotional feeling about it, I think at that time I was celebrating, on the one hand, the work that has been done by the African National Congress, both outside as an organization, leading the negotiations process and ensuring that women are participating in the negotiations, but then later on being in government and all the pieces of legislation that we can think of that has been passed, as well as the gender machinery that has been evolving, because the gender machinery has been evolving in the past 30 years, but the impact of the gender machinery is seen, for instance, in all the legislation that has been passed. I can speak about the Employment Equity Act. I can speak about the recognition of customary law. I can speak about the sexual offenses. There's a whole lot of pieces of legislation that has been passed basically because you had women in the forefront, whether in parliament, whether in government, whether in NGOs and NPOs, leading the charge for change. And it's 30 years down the line, you could hear from the people who are speaking, because I believe what the people say on the ground, on all the work that we have done, is most important. Some are saying they can see the change. Some are still saying they haven't seen the change. I have seen the change in the past 30 years. We have to celebrate that. But women's emancipation is a journey and not an event.
Yeah. Prof. Gous, perhaps to ask you this, to taking off from what Mzulu said just now, that 1995 World Conference on Women in Beijing, how pivotal a moment was it for the Global South, and how pivotal was it a moment specifically for women in South Africa? And have we seen the resistance that women faced in South Africa shortly after that conference dissipate and go away, and have men come to the party effectively? Prof. Gous, you muted yourself there. Can I just ask that you unmute yourself? Still can't hear you, Prof. It seems like you're still muted.
No, I'm not muted.
There we go. Now I can hear you. Now I can hear you.
I'm sorry. It was a pivotal moment because the part of the Beijing Platform for Action was the creation of a national gender machinery, the call for the creation of a national gender machinery. And that had a big influence on us and, you know, feminist activists and feminist scholars in the demand for a gender machinery. So the legislation that Lindiwe refers to all happened in the first 5 years, when there was a joint monitoring committee on the quality of life and the status of women overseeing civil service departments in their promotion of gender equality. The Sexual Offences Act was passed in 2008, but for most, those legislation was in the first parliament. So I think what's the biggest problem at the moment is gender-based violence, and how we are going to deal, and what the government is going to, you know, how the national strategic plan for gender-based violence and femicide is going to be rolled out, how it's going to be budgeted for, and so on. And in that sense, I don't think that men has come to the table, because, you know, gender-based violence is not a woman's problem, it's a men's problem. 99% of perpetrators are men. So we need to ask, you know, also in terms of the celebration of Women's Day, is how do we actually go about dealing with the obstacles that women are facing 30 years down the line, which of course is gender-based violence. It's also social exclusion and poverty, 20 million people on social grants that cannot really access employment. And we are thankful for those grants, but we need a much broader safety net. And I think for that, you know, the creation of employment is important. Dealing with gender-based violence is important. And also, you know, like you've pointed out right in the beginning, leadership positions. I mean, CEOs are women CEOs less than 10%. So we might have made a difference in government, but what is happening in the private sector is important. And we've just appointed our first women Chief Justice, Justice Mandisa Maya. So that is very important. Yeah, but you know, I think that it's also about budgeting and how we budget for change.
Yeah. Colette Lichojwane, I want to bring you into the conversation here, and perhaps to ask this question, because you've taken a look at the protocols, you've taken a look at the policy frameworks, the legislative changes that have happened over the years. And earlier on, Lindiwe Zulu had told us there that there's been various policy and legislative victories, such as the Sexual Offences Act, such as the Employment Equity Act, and many more to mention. But has it substantively changed the lives of the most vulnerable women in our society? Cumulative, when you look at things like representation in the economy, representation in the workplace, representation in upward mobility, but also protection from other ills like gender-based violence mentioned there by Professor Gous.
Good evening. Thank you very much. I can agree with what the professor have said, and also former Minister Lindiwe. I think the important thing that we need to consider here is that South Africa is coming from a very brutal history of segregation and the classification of women, of Black people and us. There were multiple, inequalities that women were subjected to. It was not only about your color, it was also because you are a woman, culture, stereotypes. So there were multiple, hurdles that African women was facing, despite the fact that women were perceived as minors, as incapable or incompetent in family or even in private sector. We know that, or in public, we know that even in marital situation, in family level, women could not occupy, could not defend herself, could not even purchase private things like even to purchase an immovable property. They needed to get consent from their husband. Now, you can imagine that law and also having a culture on top of that. So I want to say that definitely we are on the right direction. In 30 years, I cannot expect that South Africa would have substantively, made big progress in terms of impact. There is a progress in terms of one, political will, legal frameworks that have been put into place, consultation, participation, opening doors, and the resistance out there that's still perpetuating, seek to perpetuate the crimes and closing doors for women. So we are fighting more about accessing those rights, opening those doors and making it possible for all women of all, from all corners of South Africa. We know that even in the civil society, we see women that are successful or that are making impact in leadership are not necessarily those that are from African descent or African people. Yeah. We can see that striking a balance in terms of education, the opportunities that were provided to others more than Africans. So definitely we need to review and reflect on the gains. What progress have we made? What are the outstanding? I'll say that we also need to ensure that as we move along, we don't leave the gap too large, because the gap is too large, and there's a feeling that the beneficiaries of the gender machinery is really very skewed. It's still benefiting those that were privileged in the past. And I also want to bring in another institution which is very key, the Commission for Gender Equality. Yeah. I think as a Chapter 9 institution, which it has done extensively well in terms of reflecting, reviewing the laws that are discriminatory, that are inhuman and degrading for women, and they have really brought in number of women and ensuring that women are participating in processes like the NSP. The NSP, I can say that is one of the gifts that women were engaged, but their engagement, they have to be forced. The amount of power, the amount of energies, absolutely, the risk that women took. I think we're still in that type of a fight for our rights to access them and enjoy them.
I do want us to circle back to some of those shortfalls that we've had over the last 30 years and how we can improve from that. Don't go away. We're going to bring you more discussion on the other side of this very short break. Welcome back to Democracy 30 here on SABC News. I'm still in conversation with Lindiwe Zulu, ANC NEC member, who advocated for women's rights in the formation of the national gender machinery. Colette Litlojane, the executive director of the Human Rights Institute, who contributed to, among others, and reviews regional protocols such as CEDA and the protocols on women's rights, as well as Professor Amanda Gous, a political scientist from Stellenbosch University, who's extensively written about the national gender machinery. Before we go back to our conversation, I want to bring your attention to this. South Africa had its 7th democratic elections in May, on the 29th of May. There were 52 political parties on the ballot. 52 political parties. Only 3 of those political parties had a woman leader on the ballot. So one has to ask, has the inclusion of women in mainstream politics taken shape yet in South Africa? Let's take a look at what our parliament has looked like over the years. We'll start here with women representation in Parliament from 1994. The green bar there is Parliament, the National Assembly, and the pink-purple bar there is the National Council of Provinces. In the first democratic National Assembly, there were only 27.7% women representation. It slowly trickled upwards. It's dipped a little bit in the fifth administration, but today 46% of, in the sixth administration, 46% of women, of parliamentarians are women. It has once again in the seventh administration trickled slightly down. But what did cabinet look like over the years? And let's take a look at these numbers pertaining to ministers and deputy ministers represented in our parliament. In 1994, there were only 11 women who were ministers. Now, it must be noted that the 1994 cabinet was quite small. But if you look at today's cabinet size, it is extensively much larger. And so you will expect larger representation in terms of number, but it doesn't translate in terms of a percentage of representation. What we have seen in the last administration, that is the sixth administration, 49 of the ministers there were women. Now, one has to ask whether this is a substantive representation of women or not. And perhaps, Linda Wasulu, perhaps to ask you this. Now, women in politics and women in cabinet and specifically in the allocation of those positions have been, many have argued that they've been relegated to the ministries and portfolios that aren't the most influential and the most substantive. We've never had a woman president to start off with, albeit we're now in our seventh administration. We've never had a woman finance minister that controls and directs the purse of the country and how money is being spent. If women are saying not enough money is being spent on gender-based violence exercises, one can understand why that criticism about the Minister of Finance never having been a woman would be so significant. What is your reflection on that?
Thank you very much. I think that, as I indicated earlier on, is that the struggle for women's emancipation and gender parity, if I can say, is a journey. But we must not extend that journey to a non-ending journey, because the ending journey would be when the issue of women representation is no longer even a discussion. It becomes an automatic thing from political parties to government, to the private sector, to all spheres of women, and not just the sphere of women in terms of poverty, unemployment, and inequality. When the opportunity presents itself, it shouldn't be that women have to continue fighting. Unfortunately for us, we have to consistently fight for our space as women, particularly in key decision-making structures. And now that we also are in the government of national unity, and I know that probably Amanda as well as Colette somewhere along the line, as they do their research, because they do research, they will go into research and find that the numbers in women in cabinet, as well as the provinces and other structures, will be reducing, because unfortunately, it is, or fortunately for the ANC, you still have very strong women, and they will continue to be there, who will strongly fight and advocate for women's empowerment. In fact, today, I was very excited in the presentations that were made today, where I saw the majority of presentations were women. Even issues of the economy were presented by our women. So it means the journey is on, but the struggle must be upscaled, and it must be pushed by both men and women.
Colette, perhaps to ask you this, and I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself there. Does it matter when we look at the outcome of social development, the outcome of social engineering in South Africa, that we haven't yet had a Minister of Finance that is a woman that directs the control of resources at the purse, that we haven't yet had a Minister of Police who is a woman that can determine the allocation of resources to fighting crime that particularly affect women? Do those things matter substantively?
I think they matter. And I think we are making progress in South Africa. And I think the portfolio of the Minister of Police, I think we did have, or she was a, I think...
she was a National Police Commissioner.
She was a National Police. And then also in the defense, we did have a female minister in that very key and important department. And regarding the finance, I think this is where, we need to reflect on ourselves as women. I wanted to bring a point regarding how do women support each other? Are we able to identify those gaps to say, listen, this needs to be tapped by women. We need women, to be making decisions in these areas. I think we should not just wait and be content with being, in occupying some position or leading a particular department. We need to be reflecting on exactly those kind of high profile and very prominent position in government. So this will need education, this will need empowerment amongst ourselves. Because I feel we always expect women, when they are elected, given a position, to be there on their own. Women are lonely. They need a support structure, and the women that have got those expertise will always criticize, attack, and not make any improvement themselves by closing the gaps. I think we need to all look at what are the mistakes that we are making.
Can I just pause you there, Colette, because I just want to give Professor Amanda Gous the last opportunity as we close off the show. In 30 seconds, Prof, incremental change often is only seen years after the effect. Should we maintain that trajectory in South Africa? Is there time for a call for radical change when it comes to the emancipation of women? Prof, you've muted yourself.
We have 30 years of women's representation, Commission for Gender Equality that is really struggling to do oversight over government. I've been a commissioner. And a woman's minister who has a mandate to care for women, youth, and
Prof, I'm gonna have to cut you there. You're not very audible. It's cutting in and out intermittently. But I think we got the gist of the point over there. Mamlindwe, just a last word here. Is it time, and in 30 seconds, please, is it time for radical change right now?
Radical change is always very important. Radical change is always needed. Radical change is very much necessary, particularly because the women still bear the brunt of poverty, unemployment, and inequality. Yes, celebrating is important because that way we'll know our milestones, but radical change is still necessary.
I'm trying my luck here. Are you going to raise your hand to be ANC president, part of that radical change?
Oh, yes, I can.
We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time this evening. That is Lindiwe Zulu, who is a member of the ANC NEC, Professor Amanda Gous, as well as Colette Tlojane. And that brings us to the end of the show. We continue throughout this month here on Democracy 30, covering issues very specifically affecting women. But from myself, Oliver Dixon, it's good night for now. Cheers.